Hi everyone, welcome back to another North Green video. Today we're using Burp Suite, one of the most powerful tools in web testing. Specifically, we're going to look at how we can use the intruder functionality to test login prompts and input fields. So first, we're going to take a look at our test website. This is available on GitHub, so if you want to try out the attacks yourself, there's a link in the description below. But if I go to our login page here, we can see that we have a nice standard login prompt, but we don't know any usernames and passwords. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some random test data into the input fields. So I'm just going to put the username of test and a password of password. I'm going to make sure I have burp set to intercept, and I'm going to hit login. If I bring burp over to this screen so you can see it, so this is Burp Suite for anyone who hasn't used it. It's one of the best web testing tools for penetration testers, and what I've done is I have captured my request here to send data to my login prompt. Now that I've got this data, what I can do is send this to the intruder by right-clicking and just saying send to intruder. I'm going to turn off my intercept, I don't need that on anymore, and I'm going to go to the intruder tab. Now, as I said, you can see here that we've got our request and we've got a username and a password parameter that we are sending to the server. We're going to use a couple of different attack types within Intruder to see if we can compromise any accounts. If you're not too sure about this, Intruder has 4 different attack types that we can look at if we go up here. The first is Sniper, where we take a single list of values and a single parameter and we test them one at a time against the target. This is good for things like brute forcing passwords on user accounts. Then we've got Battering Ram. This is where we take a single list of values and we put that value into all the different parameters that we're interested in. This one's much better for fuzzing parameters than for testing logins, but I'll show you how it works anyway. Then we've got Pitchfork. This lets us have 2 different input lists at the same time, and what it will do is it will put those values in 2 different parameters. So this is a good one to use when we're trying things like usernames and passwords. We can take a username and password pair in each of these different lists and put them into the different parameters. We'll go through this as well. And finally, we've got Cluster Bomb. Like Pitchfork, this one can take different input lists. This is great for usernames and passwords. But instead of doing this in pairs, Cluster Bomb will try every possible combination of username and password that we give it. So first, let's take a look at Sniper. This is the simplest type of attack. So I'm going to turn around and say that I'm just going to test whether or not the user Dan exists. And I might not know what the password is. So I'm just going to highlight the parameter that I want to use as part of my test through Intruder. I'm going to go to this add up here. And we can see on the right-hand side, we get this payload section now. Now this gives me the ability to create just a simple list for this example. Now I'm going to put just about 5 words that could be used as a password. I'm going to use test, password, admin password, and let me in. So you can see here are the words that I'm going to try to use to test whether or not these are any of Dan's passwords. Now before I start this attack, I'm just going to go to the settings section and scroll all the way down to this redirection and say I want to always follow any redirects. Because this is a login prompt, it's obviously going to a login page, and if I get the correct username and password, it's likely to redirect me to an account or a profile page. So I want to follow those redirects. So I'm just going to go up here and click Start Attack. We can see here, for demonstration purposes, this is very quick. It's a very short word list. But let's look at these results to understand what they show us. The key thing we're looking for is whether or not we get a different response code, or whether or not there is a different length, or anything that stands out to make a single request different from the rest. If any of these payloads gives us something significantly different to everything else, then it's worth exploring. So if I look at this, I can see the response for password had a length much longer than everything else, meaning that when it took the username of Dan and the password of password, it did more than everything else. It got a different kind of response than everything else. If I go back to our web page and just check this, we can try Dan and password. And we can see that this is a legitimate set of credentials. So let's have a look at other types of attacks. Let's drop down into a Battering Ram attack. So this attack is useful when you need to send the same payload to multiple parameters in a request. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight username as well, add these characters to it. This is now one of the parameters that I'm going to be putting my payloads into. If I go check the payload section up here, I'm just going to use these same 5 keywords, and we're just going to start this attack. Now we can see here that this time payload of test has a good length here. Now if we check this, this has sent the username of test and the password of test. You can see it's put that one word in both parameters. Same with password here, admin here, and so on. This has taken my one list and put it into every parameter that I've selected. So actually now we've found that test and test is also a username and password pair that will work. So let's close this down. And let's take a look at the Pitchfork attack, our next one. Now I'm still going to look at username and password for both of these parameters. But if we look at the top right here, we now have a section saying payload position. Number 1 is Dan, the first parameter I've highlighted. Number 2 is password, the second parameter I've highlighted. So this is going to allow us to try username and password combinations. So because this is my first payload position and its username, I'm going to quickly remove each of these. And I'm going to put in some usernames. So we're going to have Dan, test, admin, let's try demo, and user1. These are going to be the usernames that I try. If I move to payload position 2, passwords, I'm going to try password, let me in, test, admin, and admin password. So for each of these, I have 5 values. So if I start the attack, let's have a look at what result we get. So what we can see is Dan and password is a correct credential. That has given us something different from everything else. A long length, we know that represents a successful login. We can see that because let me in was second in that password list, it has been paired with test. So test and let me in does not work. The Pitchfork attack is great for when we're trying things like credential stuffing. If we have usernames and password pairs through things like leaked credentials or data breaches, for example, this is when Pitchfork attacks can be really helpful. Or potentially when we're trying default credentials, when we know that we want to try things like test, admin, QWERTY, when we know a username and password pair and we want to be able to try them. This is when Pitchfork really shines. But we know that users like test have a password of test, and we can see that this isn't the best way to find out every valid set of usernames and passwords that will work. So let's move on to Cluster Bomb. going to change the attack type to cluster bomb. This is going to take the username and password once more. So we're going to keep our payload positions, username and password. And this time when I launch the attack, what's going to happen is this is going to try every possible combination of these two lists. So we can see we've tried the password of password against all 5 of our users. Then we've tried let me in against all 5. Then we've tried test against all 5, and so on. So this is going to get us much better results. And we can find out what was successful without having to scroll all the way down by just ordering by length here. And we can see that what we get is Dan and password worked, test and test worked, admin and admin password worked. So we've identified 3 different sets of usernames and passwords that will work because Cluster Bomb has tried every possible combination. It takes much longer because this one has now tried 25 different payloads, whereas Sniper, Battering Ram, and Pitchfork only tried 5. But this is why something like Cluster Bomb can be really effective. And this is why it can be really useful to know these different types of intruder attacks, because each one has a different use case where they're going to be really valuable. And we know now that if we go back to our application, we can log in not only as Dan with password earlier, but test and test, and also admin and admin password. So that's Burp Intruder, guys. Once again, the way we get that request into the intruder is we go to a login page, we put whatever we want in these parameters, we turn on our intercept, so just intercept on here, hit login, and when we've intercepted the request, we can right-click and send to intruder. At that point, back to the intruder tab, and this is where we get to play around with the different types of attacks and the different kinds of payloads that we might want to use. I hope that's been helpful. I hope you've learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Throw a comment if you have any questions, and we will see you in the next video.